Hello and welcome to this webinar. Good afternoon to those of you in the same part of the world as some of us in Europe, and good morning to those of you listening across the Atlantic. So my name is Deirdre Fulton. I'm a partner at Midas Aviation and I'll be moderating today's discussion. This is the latest in OAG's series of webinars about the impacts of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. Those of you who've joined us before, and welcome back to those familiar names, you'll be up to speed with the format where we run through some slides and then we pose your questions to our panel. Talking of the panel, I'm joined today by John Grant, OAG's senior analyst, who's been tracking the impacts right since the very start. Reminds me how many weeks we are in, John?
We're at 21 weeks, Deirdre, which we Google searched this morning is the gestation period of a gerbil.
A gerbil, yeah. I thought you might have mixed that up a bit this afternoon. We also have Mark Clarkson, OAG's EVP of Product Management, with us. Normally, you're on our morning Asia-focused webinar, so welcome to the afternoon one, Mark.
Yeah, good morning, good afternoon.
And I'm pleased to say we've also got a special guest this afternoon joining us, João Pita, who is Head of Airline Business at Sao Paulo's Gulros Airport. Well, thanks for taking time out of what must be an incredibly busy time right now for you, and we look forward to hearing some insights from you today.
Thank you for the invite. Thank you for inviting the airport, and it will be a pleasure to share this hour with you, sharing some thoughts about the future of our industry.
Great. Okay, so just having a quick look at our agenda for today. We're going to use some OAG data and analysis to provide an overview of what's happening in terms of frequency and capacity at regional and country level. And then we're going to take a deeper look at some of the shifts that we're seeing in capacity week by week at the minute, and what that means really for airline planning horizons and of course airport response to that. We're also going to talk about how airlines might start to rebuild their networks and what some of the challenges are in getting back to sustainable connecting traffic volumes and markets. And then, as I said, we'll hopefully get the chance to answer some of your questions. So I see we have a question already that came in just before we started, so that's a great start. We'll have a bit of a mix of answering your questions as we go, if they're relevant to what we're talking about at the time, but we will have time at the end where you can also put questions to the panel. Now, if you have to duck out at any point, don't worry, we'll send a recording of the webinar to you so you won't miss anything. And if we don't get to your questions today, then we'll do our best to answer them in the coming days. So having said all of that, let's dive in. We're looking, John, at this slide, which shows us the global picture for flights. Now, we've made a little bit of progress since a fortnight ago. Then we were saying that flights were 68% down on last year. Well, this week it's 65%, so it's going in the right direction, but it's painfully slow. We're not seeing much green, are we, on this map yet?
We're not. It's like watching Test cricket. It takes a long time to get nowhere. I think there are some encouraging signs, and it is about the devil is in the detail and looking in particular markets and seeing what is happening there. And obviously, brilliant news in New Zealand in terms of the lockdown is over there, and domestic services are running at their normal levels of frequency. But as they point out, without international traffic, load factors are perhaps between 20 and 30% below their normal levels. And that's interesting in the context of what we're going to talk about later, I think. But there is a degree of optimism. Saudi Arabian domestic capacities come back. We've seen a bit more growth in China. Last week, Turkish domestic services restarted with Turkish Airlines, and both Corendon and Pegasus relaunched services this week, and Turkish started some international flying. Qatar Airways are beginning to grow back out, and they have about 70 to 80% of their network or capacity back in the market at the moment in time. But there is, it's almost like there is a whole host of airlines in Europe who are beginning to rev up their engines, dust down the wings and the seats and get ready to fly, and are just waiting for more clarity around lockdowns and other restrictions that are preventing them from traveling. Unfortunately,
And
though,
this very slight increase, well, slight, 37 up to 53 million is a little bit more than slight, but it looks slight by comparison to where we were.
absolutely,
That's the sort of indication of that, isn't it?
it is. The next 2 weeks are quite important in terms of European capacity. There are, well, it's EasyJet who are planning to start services next week, Ryanair adding more and more capacity, Wizz Air a bit more capacity, British Airways putting some more flights, Jet2, and you know, they're all waiting until this moment in time. But that, you know, the note of caution, I guess, is that 37 million, as we will see in a few slides. The move to 53 million could still only be 45 perhaps by the end of week 4, because as much as we're seeing some airlines planning and adding capacity back in July and August, the other half of those network teams are still cutting capacity out in the short term as those restrictions impact on demand.
I think that's the key point, isn't it? That actually capacity might be returning or be keen to return, but is demand there yet? Or are people able to travel yet, both in terms of they have confidence and they actually, the environment in their country means that they can?
Absolutely. I think, you know, part of that is for some time, airlines are going to be prepared and willing to operate with those 30% load factors and 35% load factors that they will have stimulated with really, really cheap fares. But that is unsustainable over time. So if the market doesn't pick up, you know, this is really a suck it and see moment for the airlines. We could see capacity coming back out as they align supply better to the demand they're seeing.
Yeah. Okay, let's go on to our next slide. So we're taking it down a level to look at the regions. So we can see that there's a very slow sort of start, I guess perhaps more evident on the chart here, towards recovery. But there's a couple of things going on here, aren't there? So Asia has actually seen frequency fall back a little. So for those of you who maybe haven't seen this table before, this is frequency by week compared to the same week last year. And actually we've aggregated these up into months now because the chart was just getting way too unwieldy. So we're seeing a little bit of a step back in Asia. And for those who are interested, if we strip out China out of Asia and we just look at the rest of Asia, the equivalent figure is about minus 59% this week. So what's going on, John? What's happening in Asia?
Well, it's the two eyes, I think. India and Indonesia are really the big factors that are driving these numbers at the moment, and the slight loss of capacity week over week. In India, there was a rapid injection of capacity in the first week of June as the lockdown was released, and people may have seen pictures of people queuing for hours and hours to get into airport terminals and travel home. And in Indonesia, Lion Air have this week cut a bit more capacity. I think in both cases, Deirdre, part of that is those two markets saw quite a strong demand in the first week of capacity being added back, which is probably related to family members and travel for repatriation purposes. And after that spike, you know, the booking demand has slowed down a bit, and capacity has likewise been adjusted. But for me, I think the standout number in that table, and particularly the week of the 8th of June, is that Europe is still at only 14% of the capacity offered this time last year. And, you know, in comparison to every other part of the world,
it's lagging, isn't it?
It is lagging, and you know, it's not coming back quickly, and that's a very slow recovery. And of course, Europe is connected to nearly all of those other regional markets. So if Europe is not coming back and Europe is slow in its recovery, the knock-on effect into Latin America and particularly into North America, is going to be significant this year. And we're now hearing that perhaps travel from Europe to North America may be very difficult for the rest of this year, and that would be hugely damaging, and particularly for an airline like British Airways, who depend so much on transatlantic revenues for a large part of their corporate cash.
Yeah, and significant as well from your perspective to that long haul international market. I don't want to steal our thunder of some slides that we have later on, but it's the prospect that there's a slower recovery from one of your big markets is a challenging one, isn't it?
It is, and to one of the questions we've already had, what this is creating is a market where we see cancellation rates that are exceptionally high in comparison to normal industry patterns, with flights being cancelled at short notice, or consolidation where it's possible, where you have a route with 6 flights a day suddenly becoming 1 flight a day. So it's a very dynamic market, and as Cheryl, who asked the question, noted, it's frustrating. It is so frustrating for everyone in the industry, particularly airports and airlines.
Yeah. Okay, let's take a look at our next slide. So we're going to return to some data that we showed you in the last webinar that we did a couple of weeks ago. So we took a look at capacity at a global level initially, although we'll go down and give you some more detail shortly. The blue line, dark blue line here, is 2019 capacity by week. And then we took a look on the 25th of May, which is when the last webinar was, at what the forward projection was just by week up to the middle of July. And then we refreshed that this week with what the latest position is. Now, you can see in domestic terms, there's about 45 million seats that have come out collectively over this 6-week period, but on international, it's bigger, 60 million in the last fortnight has come out, and that's reflective of what we were just saying, John, isn't it?
I think that's the challenge, isn't it? That it is. There is just so much concern and worry about how much more capacity will be shaved down in the coming weeks. And the longer we have this confusion and the lack of, for want of a better word, an open skies environment, the likelihood is, the likelihood is we're going to see more and more capacity being shaken out because people will not be able to book in time. So it's fascinating, but to lose 60 million seats in the last fortnight, IATA yesterday were putting out their latest forecast, 400 billion plus revenue loss year on year, 100 billion industry loss this year. You take those 60 million seats, you assume 80% of those are occupied, and then you apply a typically average international yield of $250, and you can just see the money pouring out. You can just see the money pouring.
Now that 60 million, a big chunk of that is Europe, as we've already alluded to. It's quite a busy slide, this one, but we wanted to try and convey quite a lot of things to you here. And remember, you get a copy of the recording, which includes the slides, so you'll be able to digest this at leisure. But essentially, what we're saying is the Europe share of that is 35 million seats. So taken out over the last over this 6-week period, significant reductions across the big country markets in Europe, and we've pulled out what that looks like in UK terms, what it looks like in Germany, and what it looks like in Spain. It doesn't make for good reading, does it? In terms of just 2 weeks ago, there was an expectation that maybe, just maybe, international capacity might get somewhere back to 2019 levels. Now, you could argue that might have been a little bit unrealistic, and was maybe short-term planning was maybe here rather than here. But actually, we're seeing a leveling off of that and a real reduction over June, aren't we? You know, with this
Yeah,
end of June really being quite pivotal in terms of expectation, I guess, right now.
absolutely. And you know, we've not very early on, probably week 16, 17 in this COVID incident, we had airlines like Jet2 who were looking to put more capacity back from around the 15th of June, and TUI, Europe's largest tour operator as well, putting all of their capacity back from about then. And basically all we're seeing them do is keep pushing it further and further back. So the 15th of June became the 6th of July. And, you know, that's important. But I think the chart that resonates most for me, Deirdre, is the one in the bottom left-hand corner where you can see the absolute percentage changes in Europe's major markets, but it is the interrelationship between all of those markets that is so important and so crucial to the overall recovery. You know, UK, Spain, Germany, Spain markets, France, UK markets are huge, and at this time of year would be reaching 70% pre-booked for the summer season.
Yeah.
And it's not just the capacity, of course, it's the cash damage to the airline operators, all of whom would traditionally be looking to maximize their revenues between beginning of June through to the end of September and the holiday season, and build the reserves required for the rest of the year and into next year. And they're just not there. And that's going to pose problems as we go into next year. I was talking to one airline CEO this morning in Europe, and he was saying, you know, he's not so much worried about surviving until October. He's more worried about November through to the end of March.
Yeah, the winter.
Yeah,
I think
and if I can just jump in quickly, I think this shows perhaps three things. One is that Europe might be suffering more because of smaller domestic markets. So intra-Germany or intra-UK, they are of course not the size of India or Brazil or Indonesia, not to mention China or the US. So the issue is that the perception of people about traveling on the domestic soil is much different than to go abroad. And even if you go from UK to Portugal or Spain for your summer holidays, there might be some fear about what COVID means, what I will see, or you know, on a different country with a different language. I don't know how the health system works, and that is different from, let's say, domestic Brazil or domestic China. So people tend to be more willing to fly domestic, and I think that might be one of the reasons for Europe. The second one, and when you see the graphic, and this is not to be pessimistic, but when you see the July figures, I believe that they are not counting on cancellations that will happen. So airlines are scheduling now for 2 or 3 weeks in advance. They are taking advantage also the slot waivers at the main congested airports, so they can play with their schedules much more on time and according to online bookings than what they are usually doing. And this is to say that you know, the strong belief is that domestic markets will recover first, and some of the bigger markets, like of course Brazil in this case, but also others in South America, will tend to recover first, because we are such a huge country. There is no way that I can go from São Paulo to the north part of the country by other means of transport than aviation. So we could see that happen.
Yeah, I think just to add on as well, sorry, Deirdre, I was just going to say the thing that kind of jumps out at me on all of these graphs is that show the divergence of the blue, the light blue from the yellow over the first couple of weeks. It's such a, you know, the airlines.
It's steep, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, and then to the point about, you know, as country restrictions change and maybe some of the international borders start to open up, how is that, if you like, degree of confidence going to change? It'll be interesting for us to track this, I think, on a regular basis moving forward, because that will start to tell a story perhaps about the actual underlying confidence in those markets, which is just not there at the moment.
I think there's also a window of opportunity, isn't there? You know, so here I'm actually joining you from Scotland today, and technically our school summer holidays start in 3 weeks' time. So parents, if they're thinking, you know, let's make the most of the summer holidays, and can we go anywhere? your decision point is being pushed and pushed and pushed to the point where, for many people, it becomes far too short notice to even contemplate, even if we could travel.
Yeah.
You know, I think that's the reality, that there's a window now of opportunity for a summer holiday, and that window's just, you know, starting to close, I think.
And that leads to a sort of a filtration process of what are the type of travelers that are going to recover and rebuild confidence for everyone else, because with a family unit of 3 or 4 people, taking that risk of travel, etc., is quite large, even if you do feel confident enough. And for other younger people, and typically, you know, it's quite interesting to hear about how Generation Z type travelers seem to be having a higher influence on the recovery. They're much more flexible in travel and much more confident to travel through the COVID-19 event. You know, they're younger, their statistics say they're not affected. And to Yao's point regarding domestic markets, the US domestic market in the last couple of weeks, you know, TSA passengers processed have consistently increased week on week. Southwest Airlines put another 500,000 seats back into the market this week. They're now the largest airline in the world. So they've out-trumped one of the Chinese carriers, which I'm sure Donald will be delighted about. So, you know, there's all sorts of positive messages, but you really have to look for them, and much of it is around domestic capacity.
And I think that's the point. That's the point that you were making, Joao, isn't it? That actually, you know, if we looked at the same data but for Latin America and North America, you can see that actually the volumes of change in international are just much smaller, because the focus really is on the domestic markets.
Sure, and we have a lot, and we have significant restrictions to you know, for foreigners are at this moment not allowed to come to Brazil except if for family reunion or something like that. So that of course harms the international, even if we could have services, and we do have here in São Paulo, but the amount of service that you are able to attract with such restrictions is small. And we have more severe restrictions in Colombia or in Argentina. Argentina just announced today, it was on the CAPA as well, so that of course we have no air visitors have entered Argentina in May, not a single one. So that shows how severe the restrictions are. And when you see the domestic, that's not the case. And also to give you some good news, yesterday both Azul and Gol have just announced that their bookings have been consistently higher on the last couple of weeks, and they will increase operations in June and of course in July, which is an important winter break here in Brazil. But this is just to say that definitely I think the next semester or until the end of the year, the focus everywhere will be on the domestic side, and I believe that in Europe should be regional as well. So Europe we can see it as a big region with mostly the same type of approach to a regulatory framework.
I think it's really interesting to hear, though, that bookings are picking up, because I think it's easy to forget that actually the pace of the spread of the pandemic is you know, you're still slightly behind Europe and even North America to some extent, aren't you? In Latin America, that you know, the worst of the crisis potentially, you're in that zone right now. So actually to hear that you know, there's a bit of optimism, I think that's great. I think that's really encouraging.
Yeah, no. I mean, we can see this from different perspectives, and here perhaps talk a little bit more about Brazil. Is the size is very big. So we have 210 million people, and of course the shape of the COVID-19 in Brazil is not good at the moment. Perhaps is coming into an improving phase, but is not where Europe is already, because we are lagging. We started after, so we're also going to soften up the curve later on than other regions, but we are very big. So when we see, for instance, the number of deaths, we also need to understand the population. So at the end, this is a trend. this is a tragedy, that's for sure, and the numbers are brutal, but you also need to put the numbers in the context that we have 2/3 of the population of the US, and we have less than 1/3 of the death. So we need to put this in perspective, and I think, but of course, other countries in South America are doing much better. So the number of cases and deaths in Argentina are much lower, in Chile as well. So we need to see the different dynamics of the region, but looking to the future, definitely we should be able to do a bubble here in the region. We should be able to open our borders to our neighborhoods, and try to start not only to promote aviation by itself, but to promote the tourism sector, because I believe that some regions in Brazil and definitely regions in other countries in South America, they are suffering, and they will suffer much more if they cannot attract tourists for the next couple of months.
So it could be actually that, we talked on our last webinar, I think, about the idea that travel bubbles might be a way to ease the aviation industry sort of back into recovery. And actually, if you look at it from a global perspective, what you really need are the big domestic markets to get going again, and then people to be confident enough to travel internationally. But I think there is definitely scope for regional cooperation, and if you can pursue a bubble that works regionally, then that might be another way of building confidence and getting people back into the air again.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I think that helps. I think there are so many other factors involved in this, and why bubbles may be a solution, because if you just think about long haul travel, essentially it's been almost impossible to obtain a visa or to get a new passport for the last 4 months for quite a lot of countries around the world. And that will have put on hold a lot of international travel as well. So, it does point to domestic and maybe regional travel, where rather than a passport, you can use an ID card between a trading bloc, as we see in Europe with the Schengen and Schengen Agreement and areas such as those.
You've just reminded me that my passport expires this week, so I must go back and check whether I can.
Well, to be honest, you'll probably need one to get out of Scotland to get to England, but that's another issue.
Careful, John. Careful.
Sorry,
yeah, two Scottish people on the webinar, John. Okay.
One thing that I know is that we don't want to talk about the UK, England, Scotland, Wales situation, European Union. That is off the scope of the webinar, right?
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. That would be a whole webinar in itself.
We'll pick it up later.
We are only talking about easy things like COVID-19.
Yeah, exactly. Come back, Brexit. All is forgiven. Okay.
Just coming back quickly on the bubbles and the confidence.
Sure.
We have perhaps 2 or 3 moments, and the first moment was when it really started, and nobody fully understood the length and the deepness of what is going on, of what is COVID and what is now COVID in the world. So I think that was the first phase, and now I think we need to look into the future and have a plan, which is how people can be safe on the airports, how people can be safe on the hotels, how people can be safe doing meetings and conferences and so on. And that is the complete package that will bring confidence back. And we are a piece of this, airports and airlines, but we are not a complete puzzle, because we need to have, I don't know, do we have, like here in Brazil, we use a lot the yellow fever certificate that shows that we have the vaccine for yellow fever. So perhaps are we going into a situation where you have like a certificate showing that you already had COVID or something like this, you're on the risk segment or not? So, how we're going to involve, and I think we need to learn with the 9/11 experience, and ICAO should be the one setting up recommendations that can be put in place all over the world, because aviation is connecting countries and connecting regions. So we need to have pretty much the same rules applying in Europe or Latin or Africa, because otherwise you can get out of Brazil, but you might not be able to get into Germany or vice versa. So I think this is important, so that we have a common understanding of how to get out of this with simple, easy rules, but effective ones.
And I think, you know, this morning we heard from Finnair about just some of those challenges, you know, around, you know, there's the challenge for the consumer, for the passenger, about how to, you know, will I be able to get there? Will I be able to get back? You know, what will I need when I go on the journey? But actually, from an airline's perspective, there's a what is the consequence of taking passengers to this particular country, and what might happen if I have a passenger who tests positive, or, you know, what are the ramifications of all of that? And I think that jigsaw, trying to put together all those pieces, is what is going to be frustrating growth over the coming months, for sure, you know. Okay, let's look at this slide. So we took our regional data down back into country level data, and this is one of our regular charts that we show. So we've got frequency data by month, and then by week again. So week on week, just as we showed in the regional table, the yellow one at the start. And this time we've given you two tables, so two for the price of one here. We've got some Americas countries and some European countries, and it really just illustrates, doesn't it, what we've talked about, that, you know, lagging performance really in Europe. Some reductions still happening as we see the different phase of the pandemic in the Americas, but actually some glimmers of hope maybe in things recovering. The US slightly better.
And it's yeah, I mean, it's a valuable slide and an act of considerable Scottish generosity to get two tables for the price of one, Deirdre. So, you know, we're very grateful for that. But if you look at somewhere like Qatar, for example, I mean, you just think how big a gamble that really is.
Bold
to have
move,
gone
isn't it?
From, you know, 87, and let's be honest, nearly all of that Qatar capacity is Qatar Airways. There's other carriers who operate to Doha, but not very many. So when you look at that and you think how much of a gamble putting all of that capacity back in 1 week is, it highlights as much as anything, you know, the challenge of a hub carrier who has one, no domestic network, and two, is linking Europe, North America to points in Asia and the Indian subcontinent. That you've got to add capacity on both sides of the pivot to be able to
make it
generate
work.
any traffic, and we'll come on to it later, you know. But there are geographic points in the world that have an opportunity to exploit their coastal advantage on continents and act as a you know, a point of all capacity across international long haul markets, and enjoy the benefit of creating more connectivity.
And that's, you know, that shift, we've talked, haven't we, about this question of whether passengers will want to connect, or whether they will want to, where possible, travel point to point, you know, from a health concern perspective. But I guess if you make the decision to travel, then you're comfortable.
Absolutely.
whether it's one flight or two.
Well, to a degree, I guess part of that challenge is, you know, are there enough people who are going to be, is there going to be enough demand for those ultra long haul services, or are the airlines going to have to consolidate their networks into those types of coastal locations, or, you know, the beginning of a continent in a particular sort of flow, so that they can maximize capacity and seek to operate with some decent load factors and revenue performance.
Yeah.
And for that, once we have to that point in time where we have the minimum basis of common rules for how to behave at the airport or within a flight, I think it will be inevitable to have that consolidation. So I cannot see in regions like Africa or Latin that we still have that many long haul gateways as we had in 2018 and 19. I think consolidation is is inevitable to sustain a flight. So we were talking just offline how important, before starting live on the webinar, how important will be connection. So here in Guarulhos we connect 40%, 50% of passengers. Sometimes on long haul, even from foreign carriers, we connect 30%. So we could easily see on the next couple of months connecting not 30 but 50% even on European flights that are coming to Sao Paulo and using this as a gateway and then connecting to the region. But the same might apply in Addis for Africa, or in other key points like Nairobi or even Johannesburg, although it's too south for that if you are not coming from Australia. So, at the end, I agree, like Qatar or Emirates or Turkish, although Turkey is a very large domestic market. For the others, on the super connectors on the Middle East, they need to choose where to fly to continue to connect, but perhaps they need to shred a little bit of their network. And one question that perhaps different airlines will have different views on this is, are you starting with more frequencies to the same markets, let's say daily to Sao Paulo, or are we going to split and entering several markets that you had before but with less frequencies? I think that question won't have the same answer for all the carriers. It will depend on the footprint and on the image on some regions, but that will be important to understand if hubs or big hubs will become even larger, or if the traffic will be spread out into smaller airports and secondary hubs.
And I think we're seeing those differences unfold already. We mentioned Turkey there, and obviously Turkey does have a big domestic network, and that's partly behind this uptick here. So this is country level data, just what we saw in the table there, but visualized. But actually Turkish are going back out with a network that serves almost every single point that was served last year. By comparison to different scale, obviously Finnair with their 30% of the network, Qatar with maybe 70% of the network. So I think this, these strategic decisions about whether you go back with less frequency but the same network, or you scale right back, are going to unfold, aren't they? As we see how carriers respond.
It's so hard. Every airline has its own network characteristics and faces its own dilemmas at the moment. So in the case of Turkish Airlines, one of their marketing strengths and one of their network strengths is that they flew to more countries than any other airline in the world, and some of those were quite niche destinations, particularly in Africa and into Central Asia. Now, unless you operate the trunk international routes at the same time that give you the traffic flows onto those niche routes, then you will not get the traffic on the niche routes. So for them, it's almost like you have to do nearly everything or do nothing. And that puts them in the same position as Qatar Airways. It's a horrible dilemma. And then do you say I'm only going to fly 2 times a week rather than daily? And if you do, your QSI scores, which are ultimately quite important in terms of your market share, suffer as well. But it's someone said to me, network planning at the moment is just about intuition. You've got to suck it and see what happens.
All those sort of norms or approaches that you took to running the business haven't quite gone out the window, but actually have airlines and airports are being forced into new ways of doing things, aren't they? And reacting to market conditions and environmental conditions much more than they ever would have done or would want to be having to do.
Yeah, and you know what? In some ways, that's quite exciting. Never miss an opportunity in adversity.
Change.
Yeah, and this is, some airlines are seeing this as an exciting opportunity to re-engineer and rethink, and others are doing things that are so radical and so appear to be quite immoral in terms of the way they treat employees and furloughs and things. So it's a fascinating insight, but there is, if you can look past the gloom, there is actually some great opportunities, not least of which, there's going to be thousands of aircraft sitting around on the ground that will be available at very low lease rates low oil prices, experienced staff available. There would be no better time if you could find a market to start a new airline.
Oh, are you tempted? Are you tempted, John?
If anyone wants to private message me, I'll share the details.
But that's to be.
You can share with me as well. So
it's quite an important point, right, John? Because certainly in history, when we've had, if you like, big market shocks, it has given rise to like disruption events and disruption organisations starting out of seemingly nowhere and creating that disruption in industry, whether it's transportation or hospitality. So it's been kicked around for years that there's a shock coming for the airline model, and to your point, with aircraft and fuel where it is, it's likely that something like that, something's going to emerge, whether or not it'd be successful, but you've got to think there's going to be opportunities there that maybe smart people from out with the industry might see this as the opportunity to give it a shot.
Yeah, I might jump in on the opportunities, and I think we have spoke the four of us about this, but it is about, for instance, in Latin, and let's focus here in Latin for a little bit in terms of opportunities. The region is typically badly connected for historical reasons as well. So Brazil is the only Portuguese-speaking country in the region. Most of the others are Spanish-speaking countries. So Argentina is more linked to Chile than Chile is to Brazil or to Argentina. But having said this, there is tremendous opportunities to increase the connectivity inside the region. And this is, if we look 20 years behind to Europe, and what we have seen with Ryanair and EasyJet and other low costs, they have forced the legacy carriers also to open other markets. And the number of OD pairs have just grown up so much in Europe, just because that's the continent that I know the most. And we need to do the same here in Latin. So if I want to go from São Paulo to Cartagena, it will take me longer than to go to Lisbon or to Frankfurt. If I want to go to Atacama Desert, it's not obvious. Likewise to Ushuaia. But seeing in Brazil, if we want to go to places like Pantanal in Brazil or Foz do Iguaçu to the waterfalls from Chile or from Colombia, this is not an easy task. So what I'm trying to point out is that we do have opportunities with the right cost structure, with the right incentives from the tourism authorities, because tourism can only be enhanced with the proper air connectivity in countries like Brazil, Colombia, Peru, or Argentina, Chile. So we need to be able to set up a strategy that uses COVID-19 as an opportunity, how we can look to the region and say how we can grow, and all the low costs coming in like Viva Group, JetSmart, Sky, some in Argentina that are now in troubles with everything that is going on there, but Flybondi and others. So we need to be able to see this as an opportunity as well. And the costs are much lower now than in the past.
Do you think then that the Chapter 11 movement for Avianca and LATAM, does that help to push us more towards creating that kind of structural change or opportunity, or does it just push that down the road? I mean, it's obviously there's an impact for you, isn't there? In terms of your airport, but I guess it's interesting to think about what that might mean for carriers in Latin America and how the sort of thing you're alluding to might work in that context.
Oh yeah, no, definitely. We are more, of course, more exposed to the LATAM situation than the Avianca. I think Avianca is more on the north part of the region, and definitely it will have a tremendous impact in Bogota, and especially with Lima, with Avianca Peru announcing that it will cease operations. But I think both movements are to protect the most important, which is their future viability. So if you need to do one step back to give two forward in the future, I think that's important. And they have made this in the right time. And now I think they will be able to restructure and rethink the networks. And when we see for LATAM here in Guarulhos, we see opportunities to even more consolidation here. So we can even bring more markets, we can even bring more cities connected to the hub, and from the hub to not only the region but for the long haul. So at the end, yes, we are going to suffer through the COVID, but I think if you look back and if you look down the road, I think there is movements for more consolidation, and then there are also open doors for low costs to connect. I think Lima will be a major place for low cost competition with less Avianca, and of course Bogota as well. So I see the north part of the continent with a more appealing to the low costs. And why? Because they can connect with narrow bodies both to the US, to the Caribbean islands, but also deep South America. So I think their place is more perfect for the low cost, bringing narrow bodies, high density, than perhaps Brazil. What we are missing in Brazil, that's for sure, is someone that can compete on the regional markets. So we only have 50-something domestic routes in Guarulhos, and that's not enough for a country of the size of Brazil. So we need more. We need smaller aircraft, smaller jets, turboprops to connect to the main centers, and for those, and then to connect outside.
Yeah, I was going to say. I mean,
maybe there's your opportunity, John.
Yeah, well, it brings into the whole thing, you know, about where does the A220 sit in South America, and whether it could have a role, because it is that bit smaller, isn't it? And therefore, you know, isn't going to be struggling to fill capacity all the time. It's and indeed Embraer with their they call it the Shark Hunter or something, don't they? Their new jet. Yeah.
Okay, I think we've probably we've covered this in the conversation, haven't we? But really, this just illustrates the point you were making really well, Joao, about the opportunity, you know, for more intra-regional connectivity. We've got loads of questions that have come in, so I think we'll move on into the question and answer session. Let's see, John, you're usually ahead of me on the.
It's the time difference between England and Scotland, Deirdre. It
yeah, that must be what it is.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting questions around the ICAO rules. It'd be interesting to hear an airport's perspective. Did they come in quick enough? Did they take too long to be established? Is it enough? Yeah.
Yeah, no. I think I'm not sure if they are enough. I'm not an expert on operations nor on security or safety measures for this type of things. But what I have heard from the ops team and what I know is that it's much better to have some good rules that can be applied everywhere than to have many rules that you cannot really apply in terms of confidence. So before COVID, you know what you need to do at an airport, right? You get in, you do the check-in, you go through security and then immigration if it needed, and then you go to the boarding area. I think this, if there is a new normal, you need to really know it. So you need to go with a mask, and then everywhere should we have a mask or not? You know, I think the procedures should be well known and can be well communicated by the airports and the airlines. And if that is the case, I think ICAO rules would be a success. If they are too detailed, and some countries will do them and some others won't, then I think it will reduce the confidence on the mid and the long term. Because I think this is more about the end of the year, fourth quarter, and 2021 onwards.
I think that's a good point, because I think actually if you think about it from the passenger perspective, you know, the need to minimize fear and reassure people about traveling, it brings to mind words like consistency, you know. So what you experience in Guarulhos is the same as what you should experience in Heathrow. It should be the same experience that you have, you know, whichever airport it is you transfer through or you travel to and from. So I think actually but my sense is that, you know, looking back on past experience of the change to the security requirements post 9/11, there was a lot of different interpretation, and it took a long time. Took a long time to get to that point where people knew what to expect. And,
absolutely, you can
it's
travel.
still not really there though, right?
No, absolutely not. You know, you could travel between two airports owned by the same operator, and as you're going through security, you could open your briefcase out and get your iPad and your Kindle out and all of these sort of things. At one airport, you get to the other security point as you're coming back home, and they tell you that's not necessary. And, and you look at it and think, well, I had to do that 7 hours ago when I was going through the airport. It's extremely strange.
I think the traveller, you know, we live in a digital age now, and whereas, you know, post 9/11, you know, a smartphone that could record your experience was something we could only imagine. Actually, I think those inconsistencies, you know, we've seen that already, haven't we, in the UK press about people's experience about coming through, you know, and people not wearing face masks and all that sort of stuff. But I think one of the worst things that come out of this, that potentially will come out of this, is the visibility around those differences will be very obvious, and will be used by the media and passengers to ask questions. Maybe that's a good thing. You know, maybe exposing it is a good thing, and that will make change happen more quickly.
Two issues that go beyond just passengers that we might be looking is, one is biometrics and contactless approaches that we know that airports, airlines, service providers were developing them, and some first examples have already been implemented, but I think this will make the push much harder for that, you know, less contact, more automatization, and you know, all of that at the airport level, from the check-in to even screening, measuring temperatures and the boarding. So I think that is one trend that was already there, but I think this will speed up the trend. And at bottom line is airlines will try and save some money because that tends to be more cost efficient than the usual process. So at the end, this can be a win-win, although there is some capex in the beginning. And the second thing is how to handle bags, because when we say that, for instance, no more cabin bags or cabin luggage will be allowed, this is a major change on the behavior of the passenger. And so I think these two items should be considered in the future. So biometrics and how to handle with the bag.
I think cabin luggage would be the removal of that would be an amazing development in the US domestic market, where it's you know, everyone puts their bag in the holders in the overhead bin as quickly as they possibly can. There's an interesting question here about you know, if we see a relaxation in rules and restrictions, will we see less capacity being cut? And I think the answer is we don't really know, but
hard to know.
If we follow the experiences we've seen in some markets where, you know, the doors have been unlocked and people have rushed out, they've only rushed out for a week, and then that demand has slowed down quite considerably. So I'm not sure that we will see less capacity being cut. I think, you know, we might end up with maybe 45% of capacity being operated this summer compared to what we saw last year, because it's just taking so long to open these doors.
And I think it's so wrapped up in all of the other factors, isn't it, about the position on the ground in the country that you're in, and then in the country that you want to travel to, and people's ability to travel. You know, in many countries, people are still fundamentally either working from home or living under some kind of phased journey out of lockdown or quarantine. So I think there's that element as well, that, you know, I think while that continues, hard to envisage taking a trip for leisure, never mind a business travel, although you know, people are starting to do that.
Yeah, and interestingly, two questions come in, or two comments around face mask in the space of 1 minute. And the first one asked, has the EU mandated mask, which was from Catherine, and then almost immediately underneath that is Andreas saying, not in Germany. So there's clearly a lot of confusion out there, and I know some airports are even offering advice and on a free of charge basis to other airports, that are smaller than them, about how they are interpreting the rules and the requirements. But getting that consistency across the world is...
Yeah, and I think...
yeah.
Sorry, John, I would just mention that is a very good example of something that is very straightforward. Do you need to use or not? Yes or no? And if we have doubts on those type of questions, and I believe most of us here on the call are from the aviation or industry, or at least from this sector, if we do have doubts about this, it shows that this is not obvious, and that's what I'm saying. If you keep back to the basics, very key principles that everybody should use, that everybody should comply on, and then move on to again avoid the 9/11.
Absolutely.
Situation.
And I whenever I travel with my mother-in-law, I've always insisted she wears a face mask, but she's never listened to me. And COVID-19 might just be the solution to a perennial...
Well, she might not travel with you, John. I think that might be the solution.
That's very true.
I think that point, there's a couple of questions on from that about the passenger experience. Airports and airlines have worked really hard. Tom, thanks for this question, to improve the passenger experience. But there's a risk, isn't there, that travel becomes a real negative experience because of this fear that we have had instilled in us about keep your distance from other people. You never know
not
who's
only
going to be
but just the visibility of it. Apparently anyone under 2 years of age will not be required to wear a face mask, but for an 18-month-old child who's reasonably aware of their surroundings, to suddenly see their parents wearing face masks on board an aircraft for 10 or 12 hours could be an absolutely distressing situation.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got a few minutes left, so there's probably the opportunity for a couple more questions.
Mention of Africa. Rodolfo asked us, no mention of Africa. How long have you got, Rodolfo? I guess clearly still a long way from its regular levels of capacity. Major structural issues in South Africa, of course, with SAA and Comair, although the future for Comair at least looks like there will be some shape of operation by the end of the year if they secure the necessary refinancing. And Ethiopian are, a very well run and established airline. But we have said for many years, there is a point where consolidation across Africa was required, and you just hope that there is enough foresight and there is enough leadership that some of the archaic rules and regulations and protectionist activities that we've seen in Africa will ease up, and the benefit of air travel will be realized, because it's not just an aviation catastrophe that we've seen. Africa is just about to suffer from a huge poverty and potentially a huge shortage and potential famines if the airline industry doesn't get back and support the wider economies.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Joao, any final thoughts from you in closing?
Me or John?
Sorry, you.
No,
my bad pronunciation.
They never ask me. It's always the guest that gets asked that question.
No, very quickly. I think this is of course the major challenge that we have faced. Now zooming into Latin, there are opportunities. We need to go through these 2 or 3 months where we have lockdowns and quarantines, but after that we need to look to the future and really rethink how people move inside the region, how people connect to the long haul flights to the other regions, and make a strong appeal that tourism and activities in Latin America, they are unique. So you have so many different things in Latin America to explore. You have Machu Picchu, you have the beaches in the Caribbean islands, you have the Amazon forest, you have the Patagonia. So we need to open more the region to the foreign tourists. So we had 6.5 million tourists in Brazil. Of those, roughly 2 million are Argentinians. So outside Argentina is roughly, let's say, 4.5 million people coming to Brazil on a year basis. And it is pretty much, it's a very low number comparing to what it should be and what it could be and what Brazil deserves. And the same applies to other countries. So I think we need to use the next couple of months to survive first, to have all the measures needed to be a safe environment, but then to really understand that we have a lot to do. And we have the right setup, we have the right industry, airlines, airports well prepared, and then to go to the market and convince the airline to come back.
And I think there is one really important factor there. If people in the region take 2 trips a year between now and the end of the year end on holiday and vacation, if they possibly can, it will probably be cheaper than one international long haul journey, and it will have far greater impact on their local economies. So if that's the message, just travel in your own region and travel frequently.
Yeah, with the hope that that will enable confidence to return and cash flows to start again, on both sides, for airlines and for regional economies. Because that's the reality, isn't it? We need people to get back in the air again and travel for business and for leisure.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, I think we're just about out of time, and we've heard some fascinating insights. I think we could talk for the rest of the afternoon here, couldn't we, about structural change in the industry, what might happen, what opportunities there are. I think it's fantastic to hear such upbeat thinking, particularly when all that has been around us isn't particularly upbeat. So I think it's a real opportunity, isn't it, to try and shift the narrative a little bit from how bad things are to what opportunities are there, and how might things look going forward. As we said at the outset, if we haven't managed to answer your question, and we've had lots of them, so thanks to all of you listening for your engagement. We will do our best to get back to you in the coming days, and of course we'll send a recording of this afternoon to everybody who registered to attend today. We've been running these webinars every fortnight, so we would hope to be doing another one in a couple of weeks' time. But keep an eye on OAG's website for that, and we'll be in touch to let you know when the next one is, and indeed what the topic is. I suppose a sneak preview is we might take a look at the Middle East and potentially Africa the next time, but we won't make any promises on that. So as I have said, if you keep an eye on OAG's website, you can either sign up for the blog, where you'll get regular updates on our latest thinking on the industry, but you can also download some of the data sets that we've been talking through on this webinar and on previous webinars. So take a look at that, and we will hopefully see some or all of you again on the next one. Finally, thanks very much to the panel for joining and for your interesting insights and thoughts. And let's keep the conversation going on. Thank you to the panel.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. And we'll leave it there. Thank you.